Welcome to the 9th video in this module. In the previous video, we examined the most foundational of all dialectical dilemmas in DBT, the dilemma of acceptance versus change. In this video, we will explore 5 more dialectical dilemmas which are especially relevant to trauma survivors. So let's get started. If you remember from a previous video, we talked about the polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory explains why trauma survivors have extremes of too much or too little. So remember, the sympathetic nervous system is like that accelerator, and if we accelerate enough, we'll end up with fight or flight. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is like that brake, and if we brake enough, we'll end up with freeze. Which of those systems is overactivated and supercharged in trauma survivors? Remember, the answer is both. This phenomenon of both too much and too little leads to a variety of what DBT calls dialectical dilemmas. Dialectical dilemma is basically when a client is stuck at the extremes. So binary extremes leading to dysfunction. With trauma survivors, this occurs in 5 distinct areas. The areas of awareness, thinking, emoting, reacting, and relating. So in each of these domains, trauma survivors end up with responses that are either too much or too little, or both. For example, with awareness, trauma survivors end up with both over-awareness and under-awareness. In clinical terminology, that would be hypervigilance versus dissociation. Trauma survivors also end up with both overthinking and underthinking. Or in more clinical terminology, obsessive rumination versus impulsive decision-making. Trauma survivors also end up with both over-emoting and under-emoting. In other words, emotional overwhelm versus emotional numbing. Trauma survivors also end up with both overreacting and underreacting. So in other words, maladaptive coping versus paralysis. And finally, trauma survivors also end up with both over-relating to other people versus under-relating. Or in other words, too much aggression versus too much passivity. Trauma-focused DBT provides a middle path for each of these dialectical dilemmas. The middle path between too much awareness or not enough awareness is mindfulness. The middle path between too much thinking or not enough thinking is dialectical thinking. The middle path between over-emoting or not emoting enough is emotion regulation. The middle path between overreacting versus underreacting is distress tolerance. And the middle path between aggression and passivity, or over-relating to others versus under-relating, is interpersonal effectiveness. That's why, in summary, TFDBT teaches the following skill sets: mindfulness, dialectical thinking, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. That's how we teach clients the middle path between the extremes that trauma causes them to experience. I actually like to think of DBT as simply developing balance therapy. That, in plain English, is precisely what we mean by dialectical behavioral therapy, just in terminology that are a real-world language that our clients actually use. So let's summarize with a few key points from this module. First of all, the polyvagal theory predicts the polarities we see in trauma survivors. Since both the sympathetic nervous system, the accelerator, and the parasympathetic nervous system, the brake, have been hijacked, trauma survivors display a variety of responses which are either too much or too little, or both. Second, for example, trauma survivors tend to demonstrate both over-awareness and under-awareness. Hypervigilance versus dissociation. Both overthinking and underthinking, or obsessive rumination versus impulsive decision-making. Both over-emoting and under-emoting, or emotional overwhelm versus emotional numbness. Both overreacting and underreacting, maladaptive coping versus paralysis. These tendencies even affect relationships which become either too aggressive or too passive. Third point, the 5 skill sets taught in DBT provide a practical middle path between each of these polarities. For example, mindfulness provides a middle path between hypervigilance versus dissociation. Distress tolerance provides a middle path between overreacting or maladaptive coping and underreacting or paralysis. Dialectical thinking provides a middle path between rumination versus impulsivity. Emotion regulation provides a middle path between emotional overwhelm versus emotional numbness. And interpersonal effectiveness provides a middle path between too much aggression versus too much passivity.